Good morning. My name is Bruce Jones. I'm the Vice President and the Director for Foreign Policy here at Brookings, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Brookings this morning. I see lots of old friends in the audience and several new ones, and it's a pleasure to invite you to our event with the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, Randall Schriver. I'm delighted to welcome Randy back to Brookings. We've been fortunate to engage him on several aspects of our policy research over the past decade, and while he's been serving in the administration since 2017. And Randy, thank you for your service to our country in the important role you play in this administration. Randall Schriver was appointed as Assistant Secretary of Defense by President Donald Trump on January 8, 2018, previously having served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, under which portfolio he covered China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Australia, all the easy stuff. Earlier, he held the role of Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary of State from 2001 to 2003, and also served as an active-duty naval intelligence officer deployed in support of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Beyond his government career, Randy has been a leading thinker on a range of issues that play into the U.S.-China relationship over 2 decades, and he's been a robust voice on the future of that relationship, asking critical questions to help manage and to shape American policy in the region. And with that background, we couldn't ask for anybody better to join us today as we continue to roll out our project on global China, assessing China's growing role in the world. I think we all recognize now that China has emerged as a truly global actor, impacting every region in the world on almost every issue. It's cast aside its strategy of hide and bide and is now assertively seeking influence not only in Asia, but well beyond. The effort of this project is to capture a baseline assessment of the trajectory of that now expansive global role. It draws on our deep bench of East Asia and China experts, but also pulls in the expertise of our institution's security, strategy, regional, technology, and economic scholars to try to capture the full scope of China's activity. It'll focus on several key areas of research: strategic competition, great power rivalry, frontier technologies, China's influence in critical regions, and China's approach to global governance and norms. Today we'll have 2 sessions. Our Michael Armacost chair, Ryan Haas, will chair a discussion with Randy following his keynote address. And then we'll have a panel that draws on 3 sets of the papers that are being launched or are still underway today. Audrey Wong, who contributed to an early set of papers on young voices looking at the future of Chinese foreign policy. Chung Lee and Jamie Horsley, both here at Brookings, looking at the domestic drivers of China's global influence, and Rush Doshi on strategic competition, all of which moderated by our own Tarun Chhabra, who's lurking someplace around here. There he is. Before I invite Randy to the stage, 2 further notes for me. It is, of course, campaign season, which means that think tankers are off trying to influence political campaigns as well as doing their day jobs. And at Brookings, we disclose all of that. You can find on the website or on people's bios their campaign affiliations. They do that off campus and on their own time, but it is an important part of how we think about policy impact to try to put our research into the lifeblood of the campaigns. As of now, we have scholars advising the Biden, Warren, Harris, and Buttigieg campaigns, and of course we also have scholars on leave working in the Trump administration. All of this is part of a long tradition that has seen scholars from the Foreign Policy Program serve in the NSC, State, or Defense Department of every president since Nixon, both Republican and Democratic. Of course, Nixon tried to firebomb us, so we didn't really do him, but for the rest we do. Second, I would like to thank the Ford Foundation for its generous support to this project, which has not only allowed us to do this comprehensive research, but to communicate it broadly to the scholarly community and to policymakers who we hope will use the evidence that we'll provide and will find to right set and to kind of have a baseline approach, an empirical approach to China policy, which I think we all understand will be a defining feature of American foreign policy in the coming generations. And with that, let me warmly welcome Randy Schriver to the stage to give some opening remarks.
Great. Well, thanks, Bruce, and thank you for the invitation to return to Brookings. And I really appreciate being part of this rollout of this impressive project. I've been following some of the papers that have already been released, but hearing your 2-year plan to help us really both deep dive and really baseline this enormous challenge is really encouraging to know that you've got this project underway, and thanks for allowing me to speak as a part of that. So what I thought I would do is talk about our approach to China, our competition, and what I thought I would do is go into a little bit more detail on sort of the fundamentals of this policy. A lot of people, sort of jump right into we're in strategic competition or we're in a competitive environment without really even talking about the fundamentals. What are we competing for? How is competition implemented? How is it different from confrontation or conflict? And so if I could take just a few moments to do a bit of a deeper dive and explain our perspective from the Department of Defense, I hope it would set the stage for a discussion that would follow both with Ryan and with the audience. So with respect to our strategic competition, we believe that it is a major element of our overall national security strategy and international strategy. We feel as though we're in competition fundamentally because we have different visions, different aspirations, different views of what a regional and global security architecture should look like. If you're familiar with our national security strategy, national defense strategy, and our DoD Indo-Pacific strategy, you'll know that we talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific. Our free and open Indo-Pacific vision is founded upon what we regard as enduring principles and principles that are near universal and widely shared, and believe that they're principles that benefit all countries if countries embrace them. These include respect for national sovereignty, no matter a country's size, fair, free, and reciprocal trade, rule of law, and rules-based order, and peaceful dispute resolution. We fundamentally believe each nation must be free to determine its own course, and we believe that all countries can both benefit and as well as participate in preserving a rules-based order. We observe that China, under the leadership of the CCP, has a different vision, and as I said, different aspirations, and is increasingly developing the tools to pursue its vision, and seems willing to accept more and more friction in pursuit of that vision. We're competing with China, therefore, because we see China's leaders have assessed that they're in competition with us, both our ideas and our capabilities. Globally, China seeks to shape a world consistent with its authoritarian model and national goals. We see that domestic governance in China, as a result of CCP rule, is increasingly authoritarian and less respectful for human rights and dignity, and that they are even beginning to export some of these tools, such as facial recognition software and nationwide surveillance capabilities, to other countries who are learning from China's governance model. We're concerned that China has grown more willing, as I said, to apply pressure against other countries and accept friction in pursuit of its vision. We observe China using influence operations to interfere in their domestic politics of other countries, undermining the integrity of elections and threatening internal stability, using economic coercion, and we've seen certainly recent examples in countries such as Mongolia, Australia, and Canada, promoting state-sponsored theft of other nations' military and civilian technologies, exporting the most effective tools, as I said, from its domestic toolkit to other nations for surveillance and potential use for internal repression. We see them extending its military presence overseas and expanding the One Belt, One Road initiative to include military ties with China. And we see deploying advanced weapon systems to militarize disputed features despite pledges at the senior-most level that they would not do so. In DoD, we focus on the military component of China's growing global activities, and we take China at their word. They seek to be a world-class military by 2049, and they are making progress toward that goal. The Department views military developments in China as seeking to erode U.S. military advantages. They're working to become a preeminent power in the Indo-Pacific region while simultaneously undertaking plans to expand overseas presence and develop capabilities to sustain operations farther from Chinese shores. We see China widening the PLA's operational reach to match what its leaders consider to be the global nature of China's economic and national interests. Press reporting indicates that China has sought to expand its military basing and access in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the Western Pacific. Chairman Xi Jinping himself has called for the completion of a security system for OBOR to strengthen protection of its overseas interests to ensure the security of major overseas projects and personnel. China's defense minister has also cited OBOR as a framework for China to increase its military cooperation with other countries. While our competition with China takes place on various levels, at the most fundamental and basic level, what we're really competing for is to sustain a position within the regional and international system which allows us to promote, support, and protect a liberal, rules-based order whose institutions, rules, and norms have fostered peace for decades. And all of this matters because if the CCP and China were to be successful and its authoritarian approach were to become ascendant, the world could look much different. States will find they have less control of their political and economic decisions. Institutions could become less independent and less effective, such as ASEAN and other regional organizations. Freedom of the seas and overflight in the Indo-Pacific may be challenged, the freedom of those bodies of water. We could also see a normalization of the lack of respect for individual and human rights. All of this portends a less free and less open and more unstable Indo-Pacific region with high potential for these trends to manifest on a global scale. As I said, we view competition as being different than confrontation and conflict. A competitive strategy with China is not meant to lead us to conflict. For the United States, we seek to maintain competition as a stable deterrent that avoids conflict. While we compete vigorously with China, our military-to-military contacts are aimed at reducing risk and promoting international norms and standards. We'll cooperate with China where our interests align while competing within a rules-based framework where our interests diverge. And we will continue to call out China's behaviors that are counter to that rules-based order. So briefly, DoD's response, and as I said, changing our mindset, we seek to regain the advantage and play to our strengths. Our goal is to deter China from pursuing a fait accompli and to improve our capacity to deter and prevail at the outset of a crisis. Meeting the China challenge requires this fundamental shift in mindset of our defense establishment. We're no longer in a period of overwhelming American dominance, but rather one in which our armed forces are adapting to fight against near-peer competitors who are fielding increasingly sophisticated capabilities. Instead of expecting to dominate an opponent, our armed forces are learning to expect to be contested throughout a fight while achieving the political objectives set for them. Our national defense strategy and our Indo-Pacific strategy within the department focuses on a couple of pillars that will be key enablers for us to succeed. Namely, the first two pillars of our national defense strategy, which include building a more lethal joint force and strengthening our alliances and partnerships. The first line of effort, preparing a more lethal and resilient joint force, takes into account the scope and pace of our competitors' ambitions and capabilities and prioritizes investment in modernizing key U.S. capabilities across a range of domains: our nuclear forces, space and cyber capabilities, missile defense, and looks at how our force can be resilient in having more access options, dispersal opportunities, and adaptive basing. Within my office, we're also changing how we organize for long-term strategic competition. In June, our Deputy Secretary approved the establishment of a new Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China. This position is both outward-looking and inward-looking, the inward part being to help us drive alignment on China across the department as we carry out our national defense strategy and its implementation. The second line of effort in our national defense strategy is strengthening alliances and attracting new partners. America's alliances and partnerships are a crucial and durable asymmetric advantage that no other country can match. For countries that value a rules-based order, the strongest way we can demonstrate our support for these principles is the action we take, both individually and together, to uphold a free and open region. Our alliances and partnerships are important for a myriad of reasons. For example, there is inherent trust and confidence building that comes with combined training and interoperability. Militaries that train together and trust one another are more adaptive, agile, interoperable, and survivable. In this vein, the Department is expanding collaborative planning, prioritizing requests for U.S. military equipment sales to deepen interoperability and training for high-end combat missions in alliance, bilateral, and multilateral exercises. We look to strengthen both traditional partners and relationships, such as Japan, and we are working to integrate our national defense strategy with Japan's National Defense Program guidelines. And we're also working very intently and seriously on important emerging relationships, such as with India, Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam. The 10 ASEAN members and U.S. Navy forces tested interoperability, command and control, and key maritime security tasks during our first ever annual, what we hope now is annual, U.S. ASEAN maritime exercise last month. We're also enhancing our engagement in areas such as the Pacific Islands to preserve a free and open order. And we have enhanced our engagement in the freely associated states and beyond in that regard. Beyond the Indo-Pacific, the Department is engaging allies and partners across the globe, and we have brought the China challenge into our discussions in Europe and the Middle East, for example. China and others recognize our advantages and are actively working to disrupt our alliances and partnerships in these key areas, but we nonetheless see a strong interest in greater alignment on these challenges from our partners. We are also exercising with our partners in real-world operations to include enforcement of the sanctions against North Korea. Japan in Yokosuka hosts the Enforcement Coordination Cell, a command center of 8 countries, to include South Korea, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Japan, and France, who are all committed to enforcing the UN Security Council resolutions. We're also working with our partners in the maritime spaces to include the South China Sea, and are working with partners to build capacity through initiatives such as the Maritime Security Initiative, which has boosted key partners' abilities and helped them conduct maritime security and awareness operations. We're also part of a whole-of-government approach, which is allied and partner-centric response to China's expanding influence and coercion and their interest in acquiring and advantaging themselves in the high-tech area. We have ongoing deep conversations with our allies about protection of the innovation base and about the risks associated with new technologies such as 5G. To conclude, the unfolding long-term strategic competition with China is the defining challenge of our generation, and we embrace that at DoD. Our current trajectory is largely driven by the ambitions and choices of Chairman Xi and the CCP elite, the acquisition of capabilities to apply toward realizing those ambitions, and the current policy choices and actions which demonstrate active pursuit of those ambitions. We remain open to changing this trajectory, and our vision for free and open Indo-Pacific is in fact inclusive and affirmative for any country, China included, who choose to support the enduring principles embedded in our vision. But we should be clear that we do understand these to be consequential times, and consequential decisions must be taken. The costs associated with complacency could be extremely high, but the benefits of competing well and competing to prevail are equally high. With that, I look forward to the conversation with Ryan and the questions and discussion that may follow. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Assistant Secretary, thank you for being here with us. Thank you for providing such a rich and nutritious overview of the work that is being done in your area of responsibility at the Pentagon. I want to give the audience a chance to jump in because I know there are a lot of questions that they would like to pose to you. But before I turn it over to this distinguished group, I did want to ask you a few scene-setting questions building upon your comments today. First, you talked a bit about the U.S.-China military-to-military relationship. I was wondering if you could just sort of take us into the engine room a little bit of that. How is it working, and is it being insulated from ups and downs in the overall relationship, or is it a derivative of it?
Well, we continue to hear from our Chinese interlocutors that they want the mill-to-mill relationship to be a stabilizing force in the overall relationship. We welcome that. So we have maintained a robust level of engagement to include high-level engagement. I think 2018 was the first year on record where there was both a SecDef visit to China and a counterpart visit in the same calendar year. So by that metric, our engagement remains robust. Our focus is on how we engage with China in this context of overall competition. So that places a premium on confidence-building measures, on safety of operations, so things like the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, other measures that help us to ensure a safe operating environment while we know we operate in close proximity to one another with greater frequency, how we make sure there's no unintended incident or accident. So that continues. I plan to go to China next week. So our policy talks continue, our emphasis on confidence-building measures and safety continues. So there are perturbations, but I see many old-timers in the audience. We're more insulated from the political ups and downs than we used to be, and I think that's a good thing.
I agree. That's great. Strategic competition was a theme of your presentation. It's also one of the themes of this event today. Can you talk to us a little bit about where that competition is felt most acutely in your day-to-day work, and also where you expect your successor 10 years from now, in 2029, to feel the competition most acutely?
So I would say there's an inside aspect to that and then an external aspect. The inside aspect is we're doing a lot to drive the defense enterprise into alignment for this long-term competition. I mentioned the standing up of a new DASD. A lot of that is to help us internally with the Joint Staff and the services as they make their respective decisions to make sure that it's appropriate for the competition and the environment that we see. The external piece is, again, working with allies and partners. We do think that that's an asymmetrical advantage that just can't be matched. And of course, also some contested areas, South China Sea, some relationships that might be contested where China has ambitions where we want to invest more. So I mentioned the Pacific Islands and parts of Southeast Asia. So it's playing out, we're sort of building the airplane as we're flying it, if you will, because we're in a competitive environment now. But to get to your second part of your question, I think the work inside the enterprise is the work that'll continue for quite some time because the nature of our business, we buy things, big programs that last decades, and decisions now and 5, 10 years from now will have lasting impacts. So we want to be investing wisely. I mentioned some of the new domains and areas of focus in my remarks, but it's a dynamic environment that could change depending on the directions that China goes. I mean, that they will largely be a pacing competitor for these decisions, and we have to be dynamic and flexible and make those wise decisions along the way.
Yeah. You mentioned alliances. You've built a reputation as being a strong alliance manager, an advocate of strengthening our alliances. How are we doing?
Well, I think we have a very strong demand signal from our partners. They want largely, to generalize, we see a lot of interest in stronger defense and security relations with the United States. I think we're being resourced for that, and resourced not only in budget terms, but how our senior-most leaders are spending their time and attention. Secretary Esper just took his first trip to the Indo-Pacific region as confirmed secretary. He's the second secretary in a row to do that. Secretary Mattis did the same. So I think we're making the investments. We've got the demand signal, as I said, and we're trying to meet countries where they are. We have more advanced and mature alliances. So I mentioned Japan and the work that's doing to align our national defense strategies and what the implementation of those will look like. We have emerging partners who are not allies, but a place like Vietnam. We poll at 92% favorable as a country in Vietnam. I've been to Vietnam 5 times. I'll be going next week, and then I'll return with the secretary. So that'll be 7 trips to Vietnam in 2 years, if that's any metric. So I think we're doing okay. We've got a region that China plays very prominently in, and they have the ability to use economic weight and their own diplomacy. So it is a competitive environment. And then we have, a different approach to issues like trade, which also I think some of our partners are trying to get their hands around and understand the trajectory of that. So, that's part of the environment we work in. But I won't give us a grade, but I would say overall we're doing pretty well on the partners and allies front.
Good. You mentioned polling. Vietnam is a bright spot, 92% favorable ratings for the United States. Other allies have a slightly different picture. Pew polling in our allies in the region has shown that support for, or favorable ratings for China has gone down considerably, but for the United States it has gone down as well. This is evident primarily in Australia, but in other places as well. How does that affect your day-to-day job?
Well, some of it is understandable. I mean, when you talk about burden sharing, that's a stress in the partnerships that will sometimes be reflected in public sentiment. But it's something that's important to the president, and I think previous administrations as well, but I think this administration has been more aggressive in trying to pursue equitable burden sharing. Some of the countries, we're going, Australia, I don't know the exact numbers, but I would guess we're going from high 80s favorable to low 80s, high 70s favorable. I mean, you can fact check me on that. Some places like the Philippines, we have a different kind of leader there who makes a lot of public commentary on the United States, yet we remain over 80% favorable in the Philippines. Maybe we're down historically, but still quite high. So it's an important metric, but it's not the only metric. We need to pursue, the president's goals on burden sharing and things of that nature as we're doing what we think we need to do to compete with China.
Right. While we're on the topic of alliances, Japan-Korea is a relationship that appears to be in a downward spiral at the moment. You've spoken publicly about this recently. Can you just give us a sense of where we are, where the bottom is in this free fall, and what role the United States can or should play in seeking to bring our allies back together?
Well, I was meeting with a prominent Chinese scholar. I won't mention his name, but he remarked on the growing tensions between Japan and South Korea, and he said China's very pleased about this. And I said, well, why is China pleased about this? He said, isn't it obvious? So I think what we need to continue to remind our allies is that the countries that are benefiting from their tension is China, Russia, North Korea, and that's not a good place to be. We, at the Defense Department, do maintain trilateral relations. I believe this morning, at least, I won't comment on that because I'm not sure it actually came off. But we will soon have an opportunity at ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting Plus, where we'll have a trilateral meeting at the ministerial level. Secretary Esper will meet with ROK in Japan. That happened at Shangri-La with then Acting Secretary Shanahan. We have regular interactions at my level, including we last met on May 9th in Seoul. It was one of the days where there was a missile test, and the South Korean defense minister called the delegation leaders up into his office, previously unplanned, and said this is why we need to strengthen our defense cooperation and trilateral work. And he said it in Japanese, by the way. The South Korean defense minister is a Japanese speaker who studied at the Japanese Air War College. So we're trying our best to insulate the defense and security relationship from the political tensions that obviously are present. I think one of the reasons we spoke out on GSOMIA is because that was spilling into the security trilateral work in an unhelpful way, but overall I think we're doing okay. It's a tough environment for the defense ministries respectively in Tokyo and Seoul because of where their political leadership is on these things. But I think we ultimately are going to be driven together because of the prevailing security interests and security environment. I don't know where rock bottom is or how much time it could take. But I do see so much that pull us together. If you give the list of things that the ROK and Japan themselves would acknowledge they agree on, rules-based order, respect for human rights and human dignity, work in Southeast Asia on health issues, development assistance. The list is quite long. So we'll play a role if we can. I mean, there's some suggestion we haven't been engaged enough at a high level. I can tell you Secretary Esper in both capitals spent considerable time on this. Secretary Pompeo has. Former National Security Advisor Bolton, before he left office, spent time on this. And we're open to other ways we could be a constructive party here. What typically happens is one country asks us to go straighten out the other country and tell them why they're wrong. So should we be a more active mediator? If both sides can agree on what that looks like and if it could be a constructive role. But we're open to finding ways to help bring the two sides closer together.
If I could just ask one more question, and then I will turn it over to our colleagues here. Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Taiwan's an issue that you've spent considerable time on, you've thought about deeply, you've worked on it for many years. Right now, Beijing is intensifying pressure on Taiwan, particularly in the run-up to a presidential election in January. What should the U.S. response be to that intensifying pressure?
Well, I think we've got the framework through the Taiwan Relations Act that gives a lot of flexibility to enhance certain aspects of our approach. We've made some decisions recently on security assistance that was consistent with the law and the growing threat from China. I think this is a particularly tense period because of the election. So we're doing certain things to support a fellow democracy in carrying out a free, fair, and non-coerced election. So there's, I think very little doubt that the Chinese will seek to meddle in that election. They've tried it in each of Taiwan's previous elections. In 1996, it was missile exercises. In 2000, it was a finger-wagging lecture from Zhu Rongyi. This time, I think it's a little more sophisticated with the use of social media and cyber means. So we're supporting Taiwan as a fellow democracy, interested in seeing free, fair, uncoerced elections, particularly on the cyber piece. But over the longer stretch, certainly we'll need to continue to be that good security partner, good economic partner, and preserve space for Taiwan to keep its unique status until the two sides are in a better place to work things out between them.
Thank you. I'd like to turn it open now to any questions. We'll take two or three at a time. We'll start out with this gentleman with the tie.
Can you help me remember if we're doing two or three at a time? Okay.
Hi there, Dave Lawler from Axios. Assistant Secretary, you said in your remarks that China recognizes the advantages that the U.S. has in its alliances and partnerships and is seeking to undermine or counter that. I was wondering if you could expand on that idea. Thanks.
Thank you. We could go to the gentleman in the back.
Thank you, Secretary. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. Assistant Secretary, did you watch the web live of the military parade in Beijing today? What's your takes on that? Thank you.
Okay, and let's take one more question from this lady with the red sweater.
My name is Ye Wang from Radio Free Asia, and I have a question on North Korea. The United States and North Korea are going to resume the working level negotiations this Saturday. And how would you assess the U.S.-China cooperation on getting North Korea to give up the nuclear programs? And, well, actually, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in his United Nations speech, mentioned about the sanctions relief to North Korea. So how would you assess the U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea?
Thank you. So we have a question about North Korea, military parade, and alliances.
Okay. Well, just in order on military alliances, it relates to the comment that I conveyed from the Chinese scholar that China benefits when there's tension between our allies and tension between us and an ally. And as a result, we'll seek to drive wedges and find those opportunities. A lot of times it's through their economic weight. A lot of times it's about, in the information space, there's quite a bit about the United States being, an unreliable partner, a sort of capricious power who, of course, will be drawn back into the Middle East. And, this interest in the region is fleeting. And so, they do it in a variety of ways. I think that's just part of the overall competitive environment and why it doesn't bother me as a assistant secretary that places a premium on our alliance relationships and providing that reassurance and explaining where the benefit is and continuing a strong alliance and keeping it moving forward. That's fine. That's a burden I carry with no hesitation. The military parade or the National Day events, I went home and spent time with my 4 kids and family. I did not watch it. I'm seeing some reports on it, and it seems like there's an impressive display, and it's meant to send a signal, I suppose, internally and externally. So we'll do the post-game analysis on it, but I think it's in line with expectations. And then the last question was about
North Korea.
North Korea and China's cooperation in particular. I think, as Undersecretary Rood said yesterday in public, we believe China can do a little better on the sanctions enforcement and cooperating with us in an overall effort to get North Korea to the negotiating table in a constructive way. We've seen some slippage on sanctions enforcement, and we are willing to work with China to strengthen that enforcement effort. I've said this, probably people have heard the story, but Secretary Shanahan, then acting secretary, went to Shangri-La and he presented Minister of Defense Wei with a gift. He said, "Minister, I have a gift for you." And he was very pleased with that, and then he handed him a picture book of North Korean illegal, illicit ship-to-ship transfers happening in Chinese territorial waters. That was the gift. But the gift came with an offer. We'd be happy to work with you on curbing this. We can hand off targets at your 12 nautical mile sovereign territory and hand it over to you. We can do something more robust if that's of interest. We'd like to work with China on this. But right now what we see is actually Chinese vessels shadowing our forces that are trying to enforce the sanctions rather than enforcing the sanctions themselves. And so we hope that they can change the course of that and do a little better on sanctions enforcement.
Thank you. We have time, I think, for 2 or so more questions. We'll start out with this gentleman here.
David Little with Herding Cats. Is China trying to insert its role into the conflict between Pakistan and India over the Kashmir, and how are they doing that?
Okay. This woman over here.
My name's Liz Kim. I'm a reporter with Voice of America. Assistant Secretary, you said earlier that China was happy about frictions about South Korea and Japan. And my question is more about bilateral relationship between U.S. and South Korea. The two countries have been suspending the large-scale military exercise for long. And recently, South Korea has requested the U.S. to expedite the handover of the more than half of the bases of the United States military in the Korea. Does that send wrong signal to China, that the weakening sign of U.S. and South Korea relationship?
So we have a question on, I think, India, Kashmir, and South Korea.
Okay. Well, China has a long-standing relationship with Pakistan, and they have growing competition with India. I think India seeks a stable relationship with China. We have an important visitor this week after Prime Minister Modi's big event in Texas, and then his work at the UN. Foreign Minister Jaishankar has stayed behind, and we're having consultations with him, and we've talked about the relationship with China. They want a stable relationship with China, but there's no doubt that there's growing concern and competition there as well. So I think on a range of issues, to include Kashmir, China has leaned toward Pakistan. They've supported Pakistan in international fora. There's some discussion about whether or not Kashmir would be taken up in the UN. China would support that. But in terms of something beyond that or more active, I don't see it. I think many have concerns that Pakistan keep a lid on militant groups that might conduct cross-border activities as a result of the Kashmir decisions, and I don't sense that China wants that kind of conflict or would support that. So I think it's mostly diplomatic and political support. With respect to South Korea and our relationship, it is a long-standing, deep alliance, and we have issues from time to time, but it's a very strong alliance. When we look at something like OPCON transfer, I mean, the remarkable thing is we are pursuing it and talking about it. I mean, we're talking about one of the most dangerous areas in the world, and we're actually involved in a process that will ultimately lead to South Korea being in charge of combined forces that include U.S. forces. That's a pretty significant statement of confidence in the alliance. Now, we think it has to be conditions-based because of the seriousness of the security environment there and the need to ensure that we're as capable and prepared as possible. And so when we look at things like command structure, when we look at things like certain key capabilities for that contingency, we're going to be pretty insistent that South Korea acquires those capabilities before we agree to the transfer and not be tied to any political calendar. On the exercises, we made some adjustments. President Trump felt that it was important to make an adjustment to give our diplomats space to work on this issue. I would just tell you that in a combined environment, what you really want to stress and test is decision-making, how you, in a crisis, make decisions in a combined environment. And you can do that through simulation and through wargaming and command post type exercises. We can train on all the other mission essential tasks in ways that are lower profile, some off the peninsula, some just smaller elements, training on the mission essential tasks. So I think if General Abrams were here, in fact, I know if he were here because he's testified before Congress, we have made these adjustments to give our diplomats space, but still maintain high readiness, still ready to fight tonight, and still ready for the emerging challenges. If there are further adjustments, which I'm not aware there's any plan to do that, we'd want to maintain the same kind of readiness. And again, it's really focused on that decision-making combined environment where we need to be excellent. And so I think we're able to do that.
Well, Mr. Assistant Secretary, thank you for spending time with us this morning. I promised your staff that I would allow you to return to your day job at 10:15, and that time has come. Great. But on behalf of all my colleagues, thank you for giving us such a clear and valuable insight into what's happening in the region.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.